The call came at exactly 11:37 on a Tuesday night, interrupting what should have been the most important family meeting of Dante Marconi's career. His phone vibrated against the mahogany conference table where 5 generations of Marconi men had made decisions that shaped the underworld of Chicago, and he almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar, local but not in his contacts, and Dante Marconi did not take calls from strangers. But something made him answer. "Good evening. Is this Dante Marconi?" The woman's voice was professional, clinical, tinged with the exhaustion that came from working night shifts in places where people arrived broken. "This is Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I'm calling because we have a patient, Elena Torino, and you're listed as her emergency contact." The name hit him like a physical blow. Elena Torino. He hadn't heard those syllables spoken aloud in 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. But who was counting? Certainly not him. Certainly not the man who had torn apart half of Chicago looking for her when she vanished without explanation, without goodbye, without even taking the ring he'd bought or the life he'd offered. "I'll be right there," he said, already standing, already reaching for his jacket while his Uncle Salvatore's voice faded into background noise mid-sentence about territory disputes and shipping arrangements. "Sir," the nurse continued, "I should tell you. She's stable, but she was brought in unconscious. There was an incident." "What kind of incident?" Dante's voice carried the edge that made grown men reconsider their life choices, but the nurse was clearly accustomed to dealing with dangerous people in her line of work. "Someone attacked her outside her apartment building. Police are involved, but she hasn't been able to give a statement yet." Have you ever experienced that moment when your entire world shifts beneath your feet, when everything you thought you knew about your life suddenly reveals itself as an elaborate fiction? That's what I'd love to know about your experiences with unexpected news that changed everything. The thought raced through Dante's mind as he processed the impossibility of Elena being hurt, being in danger, being anywhere within reach after years of ghost-like absence. He ended the call without further explanation to anyone in the room, including his father, whose raised eyebrow could have frozen hell itself. Dante Marconi did not walk out of family meetings. He did not abandon discussions about million-dollar contracts. He did not drop everything for women, especially women who had demonstrated their willingness to disappear from his life without warning. But Elena was different. Elena had always been different. The drive to Northwestern Memorial took 18 minutes through Chicago traffic that seemed determined to keep him from reaching her. 18 minutes to remember her laugh, the way she'd traced patterns on his chest in the early morning darkness of his penthouse. The last time he'd seen her standing in his kitchen, wearing one of his shirts and looking like she belonged there permanently. 18 minutes to recall how she'd kissed him goodbye that morning like it was any other morning. How she'd said "see you tonight" like she meant it. How she'd walked out of his life so completely that she might never have existed at all. His security detail followed at a discreet distance. 3 black SUVs containing men who understood that their boss's personal business required protection but not interference. Dante had learned long ago that showing weakness in his world invited attack, but Elena had always been his one weakness, the single crack in his armor that enemies could exploit. Which was why her disappearance had made sense, in a horrible, logical way. Loving Dante Marconi was dangerous. Being loved by him was worse. The hospital emergency department smelled like disinfectant and desperation, fluorescent lights casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare that made everyone look like corpses. Dante approached the reception desk where a tired-looking woman with kind eyes glanced up from her computer screen. "I'm here for Elena Torino," he said, and watched recognition flicker across her face. She knew the name, knew he was expected. "Room 314, she said, handing him a visitor's badge. "3rd floor. Take the elevator to your right. The doctor will want to speak with you." The elevator ride lasted an eternity and approximately 30 seconds. 3rd floor. Room 314. His hand hesitated on the door handle because opening it would make this real, would confirm that Elena was here, was hurt, was close enough to touch for the first time in 3 years. She was smaller than he remembered. That was his first thought, looking at her unconscious form in the hospital bed, machines beeping softly around her like technological lullabies. Her dark hair was longer now, spreading across the white pillowcase like spilled ink, and there were subtle changes in her face that spoke of time past and experiences endured without him. But she was still Elena, still the woman who had turned his world upside down and then vanished like smoke. A bruise darkened her left cheek, purple and angry, and Dante felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest. Someone had hurt her. Someone had put their hands on Elena and caused pain, and that someone was going to learn what happened to people who harmed things that belonged to Dante Marconi. Except she didn't belong to him anymore, did she? She had made that clear when she disappeared. Mr. Marconi, a voice behind him made him turn. A doctor in scrubs approached, looking tired but professional. Dr. Sarah Chun, I've been treating him as. Torino. You're her emergency contact. How is she? Dante asked, surprising himself with how level his voice remained when every instinct screamed at him to demand answers, to tear apart whoever was responsible, to move heaven and earth to make this right. Concussion, some bruising, but she'll be fine. She was lucky. Her attacker used a blunt instrument, probably trying to incapacitate rather than kill. She should regain consciousness within the hour. Did she say anything about who did this? Dr. Chen shook her head. She was unconscious when the paramedics arrived. A neighbor heard the commotion and called 911. The police want to speak with her when she wakes up. Dante nodded, filing away information, already mentally assembling teams to investigate, to hunt, to eliminate threats. But first he needed to understand why Elena had him listed as her emergency contact when she'd spent 3 years making it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. I'll stay with her, he said, and Dr. Chen's expression shifted slightly, taking in his expensive suit, his obvious wealth, the way he carried himself like someone accustomed to having his orders followed. Are you family? She asked, and Dante almost laughed at the question. Was he family? Once he'd thought so. Once he'd been planning to make it official. I'm all she has, he said instead, which wasn't true but felt true in the strange, surreal space of this hospital room where Elena lay unconscious and vulnerable and still, somehow, his responsibility. Dr. Chen left them alone, and Dante pulled a chair close to Elena's bedside, close enough to smell her shampoo, something floral and inexpensive that was nothing like the designer perfumes he'd once bought her. Everything about this was wrong. From her presence in this place to the cheap clothes folded on the visitor's chair, clothes that spoke of a life lived carefully, economically, without luxury. What happened to you? He whispered to her sleeping form, and for the first time in 3 years, Dante Marconi allowed himself to hope that he might get answers to questions that had haunted him since the day Elena Torino walked out of his life and took his heart with her. Elena's eyes opened slowly, fighting against the fluorescent glare and the dull throbbing in her head that felt like her skull had been cracked open and poorly reassembled. The first thing she saw was white ceiling tiles, the second was medical equipment, and the third was Dante Marconi sitting beside her hospital bed like some dark angel of her past come to collect a debt she'd never finished paying. Her sharp intake of breath made him look up from his phone, and those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams for 3 years focused on her face with an intensity that made her want to disappear back into unconsciousness. Elena, his voice was softer than she remembered, rougher around the edges like he'd been smoking too much or sleeping too little. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck? She managed, her throat dry and raw. What are you doing here? The question came out more accusatory than she'd intended. But seeing him was like having all her carefully constructed defenses stripped away in seconds. 3 years of building a life without him. 3 years of telling herself she'd made the right choice. 3 years of pretending she didn't miss him with every breath she took. And here he was looking exactly like the man who'd once promised her the world and all its dangers along with it. Hospital called me, Dante said, and she could hear the questions underneath his simple statement. Called me because apparently I'm still your emergency contact. Called me because you never changed it even after you vanished from my life, like you'd never existed. She closed her eyes, trying to remember when she'd filled out that paperwork, when she'd written his name in the emergency contact field. It must have been right after she moved to her current apartment, when she was still raw from leaving, when part of her still hoped he might somehow find her and make everything safe again. I forgot, she said, which was both true and completely false. She'd forgotten she'd written it down, but she'd never forgotten why. 3 years, Elena. 3 years of nothing. No word, no explanation, no goodbye. And then I get a call that you're in the hospital. She could hear the hurt underneath his anger, Could see it in the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair like he was holding himself back from reaching for her. She wanted to explain, wanted to tell him everything, wanted to fall into his arms and let him fix all the broken pieces of her life the way he'd always been able to fix everything else. But she couldn't. Not when the reasons she'd left were still true, still dangerous, still circling closer every day. I need to go home, she said instead, pushing herself up in the bed despite the way the movement made her head spin. I need to discharge myself. You're not going anywhere until the doctor clears you. Dante's voice carried the authority that came from years of having his orders followed without question. And you're definitely not going home alone when someone just tried to kill you. They weren't trying to kill me, Elena said automatically, then caught herself. How could she know that? How could she be sure? How do you know that? Dante leaned forward, his eyes sharpening with predator focus. Elena, who attacked you? I don't know, she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. It was probably just a robbery gone wrong. My neighborhood isn't the safest. Dante's expression darkened. What neighborhood? Where are you living? Before she could answer, Dr. Chin appeared in the doorway with a cheerful smile that faltered slightly when she took in the tension crackling between them. Good, you're awake, she said to Elena. How's the pain level, 1 to 10? About a 6, Elena lied. It was closer to an 8, but she needed to get out of here, needed to get away from Dante before he started asking questions she couldn't answer. We'll get you something for that. Dr. Chun made notes on her chart. Your boyfriend has been very worried. He's barely left your side. He's not my boyfriend, Elena said quickly. At the same time Dante said, we're working through some issues. The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand, but she maintained her professional composure. Well, I'd like to keep you for observation overnight, given the head injury. That's not necessary, Elena started, but Dante cut her off. She'll stay, he said with finality. Whatever it costs. Mr. Marconi, I really don't think, Elena began, and heard Dr. Chin's sharp intake of breath at the name. Even here, apparently, Dante's reputation preceded him. Insurance should cover most of it, Dr. Chin said carefully, but I'll make sure everything is taken care of regardless. The important thing is making sure there are no complications from the concussion. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to assert her independence, wanted to do anything except lie here feeling helpless while Dante took control of her life again. But exhaustion was pulling at her, and her head hurt too much to fight both him and the medical staff. Fine, she said. One night, Dr. Chin left them alone again, and Elena became acutely aware of how small the room felt with Dante in it. He'd always had that effect, filling up spaces with his presence, making everything else seem smaller and less significant by comparison. Elena, he said quietly, and the way he said her name made her chest tight with longing. Tell me why you left. She couldn't look at him when she answered. I had my reasons. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, and she reached for it automatically, grateful for the interruption. But Dante's hand was faster, picking up the device and glancing at the screen before she could stop him. Who's asking about little Marco's daycare pickup? He asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was processing information that didn't fit his understanding of the situation. Elena's blood turned to ice. Give me my phone, Dante. Who is Marco, Elena? She could see the wheels turning in his mind, could watch him connecting dots she'd spent 3 years keeping separate. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, exactly why she'd had to disappear. He's just, she started, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she make him understand without telling him everything? Just what? Dante's voice was getting that dangerous edge that meant he was running out of patience. A friend's kid, she said weakly. I sometimes help with pickup. Dante studied her face with the intensity of someone who'd spent years reading people for survival. She could feel him cataloging every microexpression, every tell, every sign that she was lying. Elena, he said finally, his voice gentle but implacable. I know you. I know when you're hiding something. Who is Marco? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed again in his hand. This time he didn't hesitate to read the message aloud. Mama, when are you coming home? Marco misses you and keeps asking why you didn't pick him up from school today. Signed Mrs. Patterson next door. The silence that followed felt like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Elena watched Dante's face change as the implications hit him, watched understanding dawn in his eyes along with something that looked like betrayal. "You have a child," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Dante," she whispered, but he was already standing, already moving away from her bed like she'd become something dangerous. "You have a child," he repeated, and now his voice carried the kind of cold fury that made people disappear in the night. "How old is he, Elena?" She couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch as 3 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled around her. "How old?" he demanded. "3," she whispered, and watched Dante Marconi's world shatter just like hers had the day she'd realized she had to choose between the man she loved and the child she was carrying. The discharge process took 2 hours that felt like 2 years, with Dante hovering beside Elena's wheelchair like a dark shadow while she signed papers and pretended her hands weren't shaking. He hadn't spoken since the revelation about Marco, but she could feel the questions radiating from him like heat from a furnace, burning through her carefully constructed defenses. "You're not driving yourself," he said when they reached the hospital lobby, his first words since learning about her 3-year-old secret. "My car is outside." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of independence, but her head still throbbed and her vision occasionally went fuzzy around the edges. Besides, Dante in this mood was immovable as a mountain, and she'd learned long ago that fighting him when he'd made up his mind only exhausted everyone involved. The ride to her apartment building was silent except for the low hum of the Maserati's engine and the occasional direction she gave him through streets that grew progressively shabbier as they moved away from the hospital district. She watched Dante's hands tighten on the steering wheel as they passed boarded-up storefronts and graffiti-tagged walls, saw his jaw clench when they stopped at a red light next to a group of teenagers whose eyes lingered too long on the expensive car. This was exactly why she'd had to leave. Dante Marconi belonged in a world of marble penthouses and private security, not in neighborhoods where children played in streets because there were no safe parks, where mothers worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, where a car like his was an invitation for trouble. "Here," she said softly when they reached her building, a 5-story brick structure that had seen better decades. The paint was peeling around the windows, and someone had attempted to repair the front steps with mismatched concrete. But it was clean, and the locks worked, and the rent was something she could almost afford. Dante parked and studied the building with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. Elena knew what he was seeing. Knew he was comparing this place to the penthouse where she'd once lived, where she'd had her own walk-in closet and a bathroom bigger than her current living room. "Elena," he said as they approached the entrance, "why are you living here?" "Because it's what I can afford," she answered simply, fishing her keys from her purse with hands that still trembled slightly from the concussion. "You could afford better if you'd stayed." The words hung between them like an accusation as she unlocked the front door. The lobby smelled like industrial cleaner and someone's dinner, and the fluorescent light fixture buzzed ominously overhead. Elena led him to the elevator, praying it would work today, praying Mrs. Chun from 3B wouldn't choose this moment to emerge with her grocery cart and her endless questions about Elena's personal life. The elevator wheezed upward with mechanical protests that made Dante's eyebrows rise. Elena had gotten used to the sounds, the way the building settled and creaked like an old person's bones, the thin walls that meant she knew when Mr. Kowalski's insomnia kept him pacing at midnight, and when the college students upstairs played their music too loud. "3rd floor," she said, leading him down a hallway painted institutional green and carpeted with something that had once been blue. Her apartment was at the end, 3F, and she paused with her key in the lock. "Dante," she started, but he was already looking past her to the small nameplate beside her door that read Morrison. "Morrison," he said, his voice flat. "You changed your name." "It was easier," she said, turning the key and stepping into her apartment. Safer. The space was tiny by any standard, barely 600 square feet divided into a living area, kitchenette, bedroom, and bathroom that could charitably be called compact. But Elena had made it home with soft lighting from thrift store lamps, plants on every available surface, and photographs covering the refrigerator and bookshelf. Photographs that she suddenly realized were visible to Dante's sharp eyes. She moved quickly, trying to casually shift a stack of mail to block his view of the pictures, but she wasn't fast enough. Dante's attention had already locked onto the images scattered across her small dining table. Photos that told the story of 3 years without him. A dark-haired toddler blowing out candles on a homemade birthday cake. The same child, older now, grinning gap-toothed at the camera from a playground swing. Recent pictures showing a boy who looked exactly like Dante had at that age, down to the stubborn set of his jaw and the way one eyebrow lifted when he was curious about something. Elena, Dante's voice was very quiet, very controlled, which meant he was either about to explode or about to shut down completely. Who is Marco? She sank onto her second-hand couch. Exhaustion and fear and 3 years of carrying secrets alone suddenly overwhelming her defenses. There was no point in lying anymore. Not when the truth was scattered across her coffee table like evidence in a court case. "He's yours," she whispered, and watched Dante freeze like someone had turned him to stone. The silence stretched between them while Dante processed words that changed everything. Elena watched emotions war across his face, saw the moment when understanding hit him fully, saw the devastation and rage and something that might have been joy all fighting for dominance. "You left because you were pregnant," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "You were carrying my child, and you left." Elena nodded, tears she'd held back for 3 years finally spilling over. "I found out 2 weeks after we talked about marriage. 2 weeks after you said you wanted a family with me." "Then why?" Dante's voice cracked on the word. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you run?" "Because Viktor Kozlov called me," Elena said, and watched Dante's entire body go rigid at the name. "Because he told me exactly what would happen to anyone you loved if you didn't back down from the dock territories. Because he described in detail how he'd killed Lucia Romano after she married into the Benedetti family." Dante's face went white. "Kozlov has been dead for 2 years. His son isn't," Elena said quietly. "Alexei took over the family business and all of Daddy's grudges. The attack tonight, that was his men. They've been getting closer, asking questions about me in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson next door said some men were showing my picture around last week." Elena watched the implications hit Dante like physical blows. She could see him calculating, understanding that she'd been living in danger for 3 years, that she'd been protecting their child alone while his enemies circled closer. "You've been hiding from them," he said. "Living like this, working God knows how many jobs, raising my son in." He gestured around the tiny apartment. "This, because of threats against my family." Elena nodded. "I got a job waitressing under a fake name. Saved every penny. Moved 3 times in the first year until I found this place where the landlord doesn't ask too many questions and takes cash rent." Dante stood abruptly, pacing the small space like a caged predator. "Elena, you should have told me. You should have let me handle Kozlov." "I couldn't risk it," she said. "I couldn't risk Marco getting hurt because of who his father is. I couldn't risk you getting killed trying to protect us. So I disappeared." "You disappeared," Dante repeated, his voice hollow. "You took my son and disappeared rather than trust me to keep you safe." It wasn't about trust. Elena stood too, anger finally breaking through her exhaustion. It was about love. "I loved you too much to watch you destroy yourself fighting an unwinnable war. I loved our baby too much to use him as a weapon against your enemies." Dante stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the cheap clothes and the exhaustion lines around her eyes, and the way she'd changed in 3 years of struggling alone. "I never stopped looking for you," he said quietly. "Never stopped hoping you'd come home. I never stopped loving you," Elena admitted, her voice breaking. "But loving you meant letting you go." The truth hung between them in the small apartment that smelled like her cheap vanilla candles and the dinner she'd planned to cook before everything went wrong. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and someone's television played too loud through the thin walls, the sounds of a neighborhood where people lived carefully and hoped for better days. "Elena," Dante said, his voice gentle for the first time since he'd learned about Marco. "Where is he now? Where is our son?" "With Mrs. Patterson next door," Elena said. "She watches him when I work late shifts. He thinks," she swallowed hard, "he thinks his daddy had to go far away for work and can't come home yet." Dante closed his eyes, and Elena could see the pain that truth caused him. 3 years of his child growing up without knowing his father. 3 years of bedtime stories and first words and scraped knees that Dante had missed because she'd chosen protection over truth. "I want to meet him," Dante said. "I want to see my son." Elena nodded, knowing that this moment had always been inevitable, knowing that running was over And now came the harder part of figuring out how to keep the people she loved safe in a world that wanted to use them as weapons against each other. The knock on Elena's door came exactly at 5:30, just like every weekday for the past 8 months since Mrs. Patterson had started watching Marco after school. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she moved toward the door, acutely aware of Dante standing frozen in her living room, of how this moment would change everything for all of them. "Elena, dear," Mrs. Patterson's voice carried through the thin door. "I have someone here who's been asking about Mama all day." Elena opened the door to find her elderly neighbor holding the hand of a small boy with dark hair that curled at the edges just like his father's, wearing a dinosaur backpack that was almost as big as he was, and a gap-toothed grin that could light up entire city blocks. "Mama," Marco launched himself at Elena's legs with the enthusiasm only 3-year-olds possessed, wrapping his small arms around her knees. "Mrs. Patterson said you got hurt at work. Are you okay? Did someone put a bandage on it?" "I'm fine, baby," Elena said, kneeling to his level and trying not to think about Dante watching this reunion from across her tiny living room. "Just a little bump on the head. Nothing that a hug from my favorite boy can't fix." Marco squeezed her neck with the fierce concentration children brought to important tasks, then pulled back to examine her face with serious dark eyes that were exactly like his father's. "You still look hurt," he announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Your face has purple on it. The bruise will go away soon," Elena promised, smoothing down his unruly hair. "Marco, there's someone here I'd like you to meet." She turned him gently toward where Dante stood, and Elena watched her son's eyes widen as he took in the tall, imposing figure in the expensive suit who filled up their small space like a force of nature. But it was Dante's expression that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. She'd seen him face down rival families without flinching, had watched him negotiate million-dollar deals with ice-cold composure, had witnessed him command rooms full of dangerous men with quiet authority. But looking at his son for the first time, Dante Marconi looked absolutely terrified. "Hello, Marco," Dante said, his voice careful and gentle in a way Elena had rarely heard. His hands hung awkwardly at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. "Hi," Marco said with the easy friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. "You're really tall. Are you a giant?" Despite everything, Elena felt her lips twitch. Dante, for all his power and sophistication, was clearly unprepared for 3-year-old logic. "I'm not a giant," Dante said seriously, as if this were an important clarification to make. "I'm just a man who wanted very much to meet you." Marco studied him with the intense focus children brought to new people, taking in Dante's expensive suit, his carefully styled hair, the way he held himself with unconscious authority. "Why did you want to meet me?" Marco asked with the directness that made adults uncomfortable and children natural philosophers. Elena watched Dante struggle with how to answer that question, watched him realize that explaining complicated family dynamics to a 3-year-old required skills they didn't teach in business school or family meetings. "Because you're very important to someone I care about," Dante said finally, glancing at Elena. "And because I've been wanting to know you for a very long time." "Do you know my daddy?" Marco asked suddenly, and Elena's heart stopped. "He goes far away for work, but Mama says he loves me very much and thinks about me every day." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Elena watched emotions chase across Dante's face, saw the moment when the full reality of what he'd missed hit him like a physical blow. 3 years of being a bedtime story. 3 years of being the daddy who had to work far away. 3 years of loving his son from a distance he hadn't even known existed. Dante started, then stopped, clearly struggling with how much truth to tell a small boy who was looking at him with perfect trust and curiosity. "Yes," Elena said softly, stepping in before Dante could flounder further. "He knows your daddy very well." "Is he nice?" Marco asked Dante directly. "Mama says he's the strongest, bravest man in the whole world, but sometimes she cries when she talks about him." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by her son's casual revelation of her private moments of grief. But Dante was staring at Marco like he'd just discovered something more precious than all the treasure in the world. "He must be very brave if your mama says so," Dante said quietly, crouching down so he was at Marco's eye level. "And I think he probably misses you and your mama more than anything." Marco nodded seriously, accepting this information as fact. Mama works lots of jobs because Daddy can't send money from far away. She gets really tired, but she always makes me pancakes on Sunday morning and reads 3 books at bedtime. Elena wanted to disappear into the floor. She'd worked so hard to keep their struggles private, to make sure Marco never felt like he was missing anything important. But children noticed everything, remembered everything, and now Dante was hearing exactly how difficult their life had been. 3 jobs, Dante repeated, his voice carefully neutral, but Elena could see the muscle jumping in his jaw that meant he was fighting to control his temper. Mama cleans offices at night and serves food at the diner, and sometimes she types things on her computer for people, Marco recited proudly. She's really good at typing fast. Elena closed her eyes, knowing Dante was doing the math, calculating how many hours she worked, how little sleep she must get, how hard she'd been fighting just to keep them afloat. That sounds like very important work, Dante said to Marco, but his eyes were on Elena when he continued. Your mama must be the strongest, bravest person I know. Mama, Marco tugged at Elena's sleeve with the insistence of a child who'd suddenly remembered something crucial. Can we make dinner for the tall man? He looks hungry. Elena started to shake her head, started to make excuses about not having enough food, or it being too late, or any of the dozen reasons why Dante Marconi couldn't stay for dinner in her tiny apartment where she served meals on mismatched plates and hoped the electricity wouldn't get shut off. But Dante spoke first. I would love to stay for dinner if that's okay with your mama. The next hour passed like something from an alternate universe where Elena's 2 worlds collided without destroying each other. She watched Dante help Marco wash his hands with the solemn attention of someone performing a sacred ritual, saw him listen with genuine interest to a detailed explanation of dinosaur species while she heated up leftover spaghetti and tried not to burn the garlic bread. Marco chattered constantly through dinner, telling Dante about his best friend Tommy at daycare, about how Mrs. Patterson let him help water her plants, about the book he was learning to read that had pictures of trucks. And Dante listened to every word like he was memorizing it, like he was trying to absorb 3 years of his son's life through one meal shared at a table barely big enough for 3 people. Elena found herself studying them together, seeing the unmistakable similarities that went beyond physical appearance. Marco had Dante's way of tilting his head when he was thinking, the same habit of drumming his fingers when he was excited, the same unconscious grace in how he moved, even as a small child. After dinner, while Marco played with his toy cars on the living room floor, Elena and Dante stood in her tiny kitchen cleaning dishes that cost her $12 at a thrift store. Elena, Dante said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. How did you do it? How did you raise him alone? One day at a time, Elena said simply. One smile, one laugh, one bedtime story at a time. He's been the best thing in my life every single day for 3 years. He's perfect, Dante said, watching Marco make elaborate crashing sounds as he drove his cars around the coffee table. He's absolutely perfect, and I've missed everything. Not everything, Elena said softly. He still needs so many things. First day of school, learning to ride a bike, all the moments that matter most. I want to be there for those moments, Dante said, turning to face her fully. I want to be his father, not just the man who had to work far away. Elena nodded, knowing this moment had always been inevitable, but terrifying in its implications. If Dante became part of Marco's life, really part of it, then all her careful anonymity would disappear. They would be back in his world with all its dangers and complications. But looking at her son showing his toy dinosaurs to his father, seeing the careful way Dante handled each plastic figure like it was made of gold, Elena realized that some risks were worth taking. Dante, she said quietly, if you want to be his father, really be his father, then you need to understand that everything changes. Your enemies become his enemies. Your choices affect his safety. Your world becomes his world. Dante met her eyes, and Elena saw the exact moment when he made his decision, when he chose love over everything else he'd built his life around. Then I'll change my world, he said simply. I'll make it safe for him. For both of you. Outside, Chicago continued its relentless pace, but inside Elena's tiny apartment, 3 people who belonged together began the complicated process of becoming a family. Dante made the call at exactly midnight from Elena's fire escape, his voice carrying the deadly calm that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Elena listened through the thin walls as he spoke in rapid Italian to what sounded like half of Chicago's underworld, each conversation shorter and more ominous than the last. "Marco, we need to go somewhere safe for a few days," Elena said gently, watching her son arrange his dinosaurs in careful formations on the coffee table. "Like a vacation." "Are we in trouble?" Marco asked with the intuitive wisdom of children who learned early to read adult moods for signs of danger. "No, baby," Elena said, smoothing down his unruly hair. "But sometimes grown-ups need to solve problems, and it's safer if we're not here while they do it." "Is the tall man going to solve the problems?" Marco asked, glancing toward the window where Dante's silhouette was visible against the city lights. "Yes," Elena said, and realized that for the first time in 3 years, she actually believed someone could fix the mess her life had become. Dante appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, his expression grim but determined. "It's arranged," he said simply. "My men will be here in 10 minutes to escort you to a safe house. Packlight, we'll get you anything you need." "Dante," Elena stood, fear creeping into her voice. "What are you planning to do?" "What I should have done 3 years ago," Dante said, his voice carrying the steel that made men twice his size step carefully around him. "The Kozlov family ends tonight." Elena felt her stomach drop. "You can't just declare war on an entire organization. People will get hurt. Innocent people." Dante moved closer, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle firmness. "Elena, listen to me. Alexei Kozlov has been hunting you for 3 years. He attacked you yesterday. He knows where you live, where you work, where Marco goes to daycare. This ends now, permanently, or it never ends at all. But if you escalate this," Elena said, her voice rising with panic, "if you go after them directly, they'll come after us harder. They'll be dead," Dante said simply. "All of them. By tomorrow night, the Kozlov organization will no longer exist to threaten anyone." Elena stared at him, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with overlaid with someone far more dangerous, someone capable of wiping entire families from existence with a few phone calls. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, exactly why she'd run. "Mama," Marco tugged at her sleeve, his small face creased with worry. "Why are you scared? The tall man said he would fix things." Elena looked down at her son, then back at Dante, seeing something in his expression that she'd missed before. This wasn't the hot rage of a young man looking for a fight. This was the cold calculation of someone who had learned to solve problems permanently and efficiently. "Elena," Dante said quietly, "I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago. I don't take unnecessary risks anymore. I don't fight wars I can't win. This isn't about pride or territory. This is about making sure my family is safe forever." 3 black SUVs pulled up outside Elena's building exactly 10 minutes later, and Elena found herself packing a bag with hands that shook despite Dante's reassuring presence. Marco treated the whole thing like an adventure, carefully selecting which dinosaurs were essential for the trip and asking detailed questions about where they were going. The safe house turned out to be a lakefront mansion 40 minutes outside the city, all soaring ceilings and bulletproof glass and security systems that probably cost more than Elena made in 5 years. Marco's eyes went wide as they walked through rooms filled with expensive furniture and art that belonged in museums. "This is like a castle," Marco whispered, pressing his nose against a window that overlooked Lake Michigan stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "It's yours for as long as you need it," Dante said, watching his son with an expression Elena had never seen before, something soft and wondering that transformed his entire face. The next 48 hours passed like a dream sequence where Elena's real life collided with something from a movie. She watched Dante field constant phone calls in languages she didn't recognize, saw him coordinate what sounded like a military operation with the casual efficiency of someone ordering coffee. But she also watched him teach Marco to skip stones on the lake, saw him read bedtime stories with voices for all the characters, witnessed him discover the pure joy of a 3-year-old's laugh. "Papa," Marco said on the second morning, the words slipping out as naturally as breathing while Dante helped him build an elaborate tower from blocks they'd found in one of the mansion's many rooms. Elena's heart stopped, but Dante didn't even pause in his construction efforts. "That's right," he said simply, like he'd been waiting his whole life to hear that word. "Papa, can we live in the castle forever?" Marco asked, settling against Dante's side with the complete trust children gave to people who made them feel safe. "We'll see," Dante said, his arm tightening around his son. "We'll figure out what's best for everyone." Elena watched them together and felt something shift inside her chest, some fundamental fear that had driven her decisions for 3 years finally beginning to quiet. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe Dante's world could be a sanctuary instead of a prison if he was the one controlling it. The call came that evening while Marco was splashing in the mansion's enormous bathtub, and Elena was trying not to think about how normal this domesticity felt despite the armed guards stationed throughout the property. "It's done," Dante said, ending his phone conversation and finding Elena in the kitchen where she'd been making hot chocolate with supplies that had somehow appeared in the previously empty refrigerator. "The Kozlov family is no longer a threat to anyone." Elena turned to face him, searching his expression for signs of the violence she knew he'd orchestrated. But Dante looked exactly the same as he had that morning, calm and controlled and somehow lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "All of them?" she asked quietly. "Alexei Kozlov died an hour ago," Dante said simply, "along with his lieutenants and anyone else who knew your location or posed a threat to this family." It was quick and efficient. No civilian casualties, no collateral damage. Elena should have been horrified, should have been sickened by the casual way he discussed ending lives, by the cold efficiency of systematic murder. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: safety. "It's over," Dante said, moving closer until he could cup her face gently in his hands. "You don't have to run anymore. Marco doesn't have to grow up looking over his shoulder. You're both safe now, permanently." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the last of her defenses crumble under the weight of protection she'd never believed possible. For 3 years she'd carried the burden of keeping them safe alone, had made herself small and invisible and afraid. But Dante had eliminated an entire criminal organization in less than 2 days, had made their enemies simply disappear. "How do you do it?" she whispered. "How do you just make problems go away like that?" "Very carefully," Dante said against her forehead. "Very thoroughly. And only when someone threatens what's mine." The words sent heat through Elena's chest, a claiming that should have made her bristle but instead made her feel more secure than she had since the day she'd discovered she was pregnant. "We're yours?" she asked, and heard the hope in her own voice that she couldn't quite suppress. "You've always been mine," Dante said simply. "You just needed time to realize that my world could protect you instead of endangering you." Through the kitchen window, Elena could see Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, peaceful and vast and endless. Somewhere in Chicago, the Kozlov organization was being erased from existence like they'd never been born. And upstairs, their son was playing in a bathtub the size of her entire bathroom, calling the most dangerous man in the city Papa like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to let herself be protected, to let Dante build walls around them that no enemy could breach. Maybe love was worth the risk after all, especially when the person you loved had the power to eliminate every risk that mattered. Moving into Dante's penthouse felt like stepping into another universe where everything was designed for comfort and security instead of mere survival. Elena watched Marco race through rooms that were bigger than their entire apartment, his delighted laughter echoing off marble floors and soaring ceilings as he discovered wonders like a kitchen island large enough for a small village and windows that showed the entire city spread out below like a glittering map. "Papa, look," Marco called from the living room, pressing his small hands against floor-to-ceiling windows that had been specially reinforced to stop bullets. "I can see everything from up here. Are we really going to live in the sky?" "We're going to live wherever makes you and your mama happiest," Dante said, settling beside his son on the leather couch that probably cost more than Elena's annual salary. "This is our home now, all of ours." Elena stood in the doorway watching them together, still struggling to reconcile this tender father with the man who had systematically eliminated an entire criminal organization to protect them. But Marco had no such confusion. To him, Dante was simply Papa, the person who read bedtime stories and taught him to tie his shoes and made pancakes on Sunday mornings that were somehow even better than Mama's. The integration into Dante's world happened faster than Elena had expected. His family accepted her presence with surprising warmth, treating Marco like the precious grandchild they'd never expected to have. Salvatore Marconi, Dante's intimidating uncle who commanded respect from hardened criminals, melted completely when Marco showed him his dinosaur collection and asked if Uncle Sal had ever seen a real Trex. "He's got the Marconi charm," Salvatore said to Dante while Marco arranged his toys on the conference table where million-dollar decisions usually got made. "That boy could talk his way out of anything. Or into anything," Dante replied, watching his son with the expression of someone still amazed by his own good fortune. Like his mother, Elena found herself settling into routines that felt both foreign and natural. Marco started at a private preschool where security was discreet but absolute, where he made friends whose parents understood the complexities of protected life. She began helping Dante with legitimate business operations, her quick mind and careful attention to detail proving invaluable in managing the legal enterprises that formed the foundation of his empire. 3 months after the Kozlov threat ended, Dante proposed in the most Dante way possible. No grand gesture, no public spectacle, just the two of them in the kitchen early one morning while Marco slept and Dawn painted Chicago gold outside their windows. "Marry me," he said simply, producing a ring that was somehow exactly what Elena would have chosen, elegant and beautiful without being ostentatious. Elena looked at the man who had torn apart his enemies to keep her safe, who had transformed from dangerous crime boss to devoted father without losing any of the strength that made him who he was. "Yes," she said, and watched Dante's face light up like she'd given him the world. The wedding was small but perfect, held in the penthouse with views of the city Dante controlled, and Elena had learned to call home. Marco served as ring-bearer with the solemn importance children brought to sacred ceremonies, carrying their rings on a satin pillow while wearing a tiny tuxedo that made him look exactly like a miniature version of his father. "Do you, Dante Marconi, take Elena to be your wife?" the minister asked, and Elena heard 3 years of separation and searching in Dante's voice when he answered. "I do," he said, looking directly at her. "Forever." Elena's own vows were simpler, but no less meaningful. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I choose this family, this life, this love that's worth any risk." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Marco cheered like his team had scored the winning goal, and Elena realized that sometimes the best happy endings were the ones you had to fight for, the ones that required courage to claim. The first year of marriage passed in a blur of domestic happiness punctuated by the occasional reminder that their life was built on foundations most families never had to consider. Elena learned to navigate charity galas where half the attendees owed their success to Dante's influence, grew comfortable with security details that blended seamlessly into normal activities, adapted to the reality that her husband's business required both legitimate enterprises and connections that operated in grayer areas of legality. But mostly, she learned that love protected by power felt different from love that existed at power's mercy. When Dante eliminated threats, they stayed eliminated. When he made promises about their safety, those promises held weight backed by resources most people couldn't imagine. Their life wasn't normal by any conventional standard, but it was theirs, and it was secure in ways that mattered. Marco adapted to his new reality with the resilience children possessed when they felt genuinely loved and protected. He started calling Dante's extended family by proper titles, learned basic Italian from his great-uncle Salvatore, and developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing powerful people would move mountains to keep him safe. The pregnancy announcement came on a crisp October morning when Marco was 4 and already asking complex questions about why some people were afraid of his papa and whether that meant they should be afraid too. "Elena, you're glowing," Dante said over breakfast, studying her face with the intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I have news," Elena said, her hands settling instinctively over her still flat stomach. "Good news." Understanding dawned in Dante's eyes, followed immediately by the fierce joy she'd seen when he first held Marco, when he realized he was a father to a child he'd never expected to know. "A sister or brother for Marco?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. "We'll find out," Elena said, watching her son process the information with typical 4-year-old directness. "Will the baby live in the sky house too?" Marco asked practically. Because babies need lots of protection and Papa is really good at protecting people. Yes, Dante said, pulling both Elena and Marco into his arms. The baby will live here and be safe here and grow up knowing exactly how much their family loves them. 2 years later, Elena stood in the nursery watching Dante rock their 6-month-old daughter Sophia to sleep while Marco, now 6 and serious about his role as big brother, explained the family business in terms only a child could manage. Papa keeps bad people from hurting good people, Marco said solemnly, adjusting Sophia's tiny pink blanket with careful precision. And now he has to keep extra good people safe because we're his most important job. That's right, Dante said softly, his voice carrying the weight of promises made and kept. Family is always the most important job. Elena leaned against the doorway, watching her husband with their children, thinking about how far they'd all traveled from that hospital room where everything began to unravel into something better. Marco was learning to read chapter books and asking questions about why some families lived differently than others. Sophia was developing Dante's stubborn streak and Elena's curiosity about everything within reach. And Dante himself had evolved from the dangerous young man who'd first captured her heart into someone who understood that true power lay in protecting the people you loved rather than conquering the people you feared. Outside, Chicago hummed with life and danger and opportunity. But inside their home in the sky, 3 people who had found each other against impossible odds were raising the next generation of a family that understood love was worth fighting for, worth building fortifications around, worth every risk and sacrifice required to keep it safe. The threats that had once seemed insurmountable were now ancient history, handled so thoroughly they might never have existed. The future stretched ahead of them bright with possibilities that came from having both love and the power to protect it. And Elena finally understood that sometimes the most dangerous man in the city was exactly the right person to trust with your heart, especially when he was willing to change his entire world to make sure that heart stayed safe forever. What did you think of Dante and Elena's journey from separation to family? I'd love to hear about your own experiences with love that required courage to pursue or protect. Love stories like theirs remind us that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most meaningful rewards, and that family is worth fighting for in whatever way necessary.